Let's get back into strategy week, this time talking salary cap drafts. Welcome into Fantasy Baseball today on Thursday, March 16th. Frank Stampfl joined by Scott White and Chris Towers. Today on the show, we will be talking strategy for salary cap leagues, also known as auctions. I have some ADP risers and fallers in the month of March. The latest news, this podcast is going to take kind of a weird turn because the WBC game just ended between Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, and it was a really fun game, except for what happened after the game, a major injury. So we'll talk about that as well. Thanks, as always, to those watching us live. Please like this video and subscribe. Tap that little bell to get notified every time we go live. And if you're listening on the podcast side, make sure to download, follow, and leave a 5-star review. We really appreciate it. If you missed any of our recent shows, remember that you can always go back and listen on demand. Just yesterday, we did a live head-to-head categories mock draft. This weekend, we'll have position preview updates and another mailbag. You'll especially want to listen tomorrow as I'll announce the podcast Listener League participants. As always, I was floored by the amount of emails we received, the creativity, the thoughtfulness. I went through every single one of these emails. It basically took up my entire Wednesday, if I'm being honest. Narrowed it down to 40. So that's where we're at. I'm going to cut that number basically in half, and I will announce the winners tomorrow. Was very tough, but thanks as always for your support. Let's get into the unfortunate news, kind of breaking news coming here just after this game between Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. Edwin Diaz appeared to suffer a right leg injury, could not put any weight on his leg, left in a wheelchair. It was scary. It was a somber scene. His teammates were crying. His brother was crying. Chris, initial reactions, we don't know what the diagnosis is yet, but it seems like it's going to be a pretty serious injury for Edwin Diaz.
Yeah, it's so hard to know in the immediate aftermath of an injury, especially in this instance. Like, there's not really any video of it. There's it happened while he was celebrating the final out of the game with his teammates, and the camera kind of cuts away, and I don't know. We would just kind of see the aftermath where he's trying to put weight on it. He can't. His legs just kind of dangling, and they end up bringing out a wheelchair to bring him off. So yeah, it certainly felt serious. It was a weird scene, just going from this really raucous celebration to everybody on both sides,
Wait, you say raucous celebration, but it was actually pretty subdued. Like, they were doing they weren't piling on top of each other. They were just doing the little half-hearted hop.
It wasn't
arms around shoulders, hopping in a circle together.
Yeah, it wasn't even I don't know if you guys remember Kendrys Morales when Kendrys Morales broke his leg jumping on home plate after a game. Chris Coughlin, I want to say tore his ACL or meniscus celebrating a walk-off. It didn't really look, I don't know, it was a weird thing. It just seems like a total fluke. And obviously, hopefully, we hope it's nothing serious, but it certainly looked serious. The fact that he had to be wheelchaired off the game, off the field I've got my Twitter notifications set up for, the big reporter. So if anything comes in, we'll talk about it on the show. But yeah, it's really frustrating. Really just, what a crappy way to end a really, really exciting, fun baseball game. That sucks.
Yeah. And, there's a chance by the time most people are listening to this in the morning, more will be out there, of course. My initial reaction, I think it's probably going to be a long-term injury. I think we're going to be talking about Adam Ottavino as a replacement, or if not Adam Ottavino, they have David Robertson, who of course has a lot of closing experience. And they may just say, the Mets may just say, well, whatever, we'll go by committee and just let it work itself out the way so many teams do, since there isn't an obvious closer in waiting there. But my initial reaction, if we're talking replacements for Edwin Diaz, would be to target Adam Ottavino, who there were a few times in the second half last year. Diaz actually worked the 8th and Ottavino the 9th. So it seems like Buck Showalter has a fair amount of confidence in him.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Adam Ottavino and David Robertson have identical numbers the last like 4 seasons. They were both really, really good in 2019, terrible in 2020 and 2021, and then really, really good in 2022. So it's not like you can just point to one of them and then say the track record clearly favors one. I think I'm with Scott that Adam Ottavino would be the guy I would go with. He's got at least last year he had better control, which I think, tends to make managers feel a little more at ease. But yeah, I'll, obviously we'll wait to see what comes out of it. But my lean would be Adam Ottavino, who I was targeting. I think I got him yesterday in the head-to-head categories draft that we did. Just as someone who could give you strikeouts and good ratios if you're building a team that way.
He had closer caliber numbers last year, at least 206 ERA, 0.98 whip, 10.8 K per 9. But the overall track record is pretty inconsistent.
Yes. He was a late career breakout. Remember, he took a big step forward with, the development of his slider when he was with the Rockies or the Yankees when he took the big step forward. But he's definitely someone who's been better late in his career.
I think it was the Rockies where Adam Ottavino really broke out, and then the Yankees signed him after that. I'm pretty torn on this one because Ottavino obviously has some experience with the Mets, and Buck Showalter used him a little bit last year down the stretch in that role. But David Robertson has much more experience just in general as a closer. Yeah. So I'm kind of torn right now. I would actually probably lean with David Robertson, but I could see it going either way. I could see it being a committee, like you guys mentioned. So
it would feel a lot like the Phillies situation, I would say, where Kimbrel, there's a question whether or not he's even good, but he has closing experience. So is he the one to target, or do you go with Sir Anthony Dominguez, who has been better recently? It would kind of probably, unless the Mets outright said, "Oh, this is our replacement for Edwin Diaz."
Yeah,
it would be that same sort of exercise where you're being pulled in two different directions.
Yeah, just a brutal blow for Edwin Diaz and for Mets fans. I mean, genuinely you feel bad for Mets fans. They re-signed Diaz this offseason, got paid a bunch of money. So as we learn more, we will fill you in and let you know what's going on with the Edwin Diaz situation. There was another much less serious injury in the WBC just a couple of days ago. Freddie Freeman left his game on Tuesday with hamstring tightness. The Dodgers say that they're not concerned about opening day. Are either of you two worried about Freddie Freeman? We're exactly 2 weeks away from opening day.
I mean, all indications are it's a minor thing and he'll be fine. So I don't have any reason to disbelieve that at this point.
All right. Carlos Rodon's rehab from the forearm strain is apparently going well, and he could miss just 2 to 3 starts if he doesn't have any setbacks. Key words there. If he does not have any setbacks. So we just don't know for sure. Chris, the ADP on Rodon since last Friday. The news came out on Thursday. So from Friday on, his ADP is 98.4, just behind Tristan McKenzie and Robbie Ray. Kind of feels like the right range.
Yeah, clearly everybody's just drafting off of my rankings because I think that's pretty much exactly where I moved him. 95th was where I moved him in my initial reaction when you and I talked about it on the pod, and feel no need to move him up or down from that point. But, this is a tough one because it's like if everything goes right, but he's a pitcher, throws 98 miles an hour, everything rarely goes right for pitchers. That's kind of the whole thing. So it's like, it's not just a question of can he get back after missing, 10 days of the regular season. It's can he then avoid injuries moving forward? He clearly carries more injury risk than Robbie Ray and Tristan McKenzie, who's being drafted around. He also has much more upside than either of those two guys, in my opinion. So it's a fine area for him to be drafted. If you take him off your draft board, I understand that, but I think he's worth the gamble there.
Scott, we had a bunch of prospects sent down, and not just prospects, formerly major league players. Ian Anderson and Bryce Elder, both optioned by the Braves, meaning that Jared Schuster and Dylan Dodd will battle for the final rotation spot. And both had really good numbers in the minors last year. Schuster pitched 10 games at AAA, much more than that overall, but he did get up to AAA. Dodd, 142 innings in the minors last year, 1 start at AAA. But it seems like both are ready. And honestly, both of their numbers were really good last season in the minors too.
Yeah, so I know less about Dodd. Schuster, as I think you said, was the Braves' first round pick in the draft a couple years ago, and he's kind of more of a crafty lefty, I would say. Doesn't throw especially hard, has a really good changeup, has a slider that's come around recently to kind of round out his arsenal. So it's those types of pitchers can sometimes be underrated as prospects and then go on to be very effective major league pitchers, or they're, kind of middling stuff ends up playing as kind of middling. It's just hard to tell. I think I'm more excited about Dodd. Actually, I've seen a lot of people in deeper leagues I'm in with this news go for Schuster, and maybe it'll be Schuster, but I was looking at Dodd's numbers, and I need to read up more on him. 24 years old, was their third round pick 2 years ago. And after arriving at AA last year, started at high A, but after arriving at AA, had a 3.23 ERA, 62 strikeouts in 53 innings, a 69% strike rate, which is about as good as it gets, and a 16% swinging strike rate, which also it doesn't get much better than that. So the fact that he has that like premium control and still the potential to miss bats at that rate, at least in the minor league ranks, and so far spring has been just as impressive. I'm definitely going to take a closer look at this Dylan Dodd character, and maybe he'll be the one to get the shot as the fifth starter.
According to MLB Pipeline, they have his control as his best tool, 60 grade with the slider and changeup at 55. So potentially two solid secondary offerings to go along with really good control. That is Dylan Dodd competing for the fifth starter job with the Atlanta Braves. A couple other prospects just worth mentioning, getting sent back down to the minors. Manuel Valdez was actually having a good spring training. I thought he had a chance to make the team. That's with the Red Sox. Endy Rodriguez with the Pirates. Edouard Julien, soon, my friend, soon, with the Minnesota Twins. Connor Norby, Jackson Holiday, Joey Ortiz with the Orioles. And then Ellie De La Cruz, Matt McClain, and Christian Encarnacion Strand with the Reds, which you hate to see it, obviously, from a fantasy perspective. I get it from a real-life Reds perspective. He hasn't played at AAA yet. He's a little bit older at 23 years old, but I get it for them. It just kind of sucks for fantasy guys.
Yeah, I kind of had that feeling once I saw Votto was back to playing in games with, still a couple more weeks to go in spring training. That was always Encarnacion Strand's path, is filling in for Votto. But as I mentioned during our mock draft, the fact that we saw these like Ian Anderson and Christian Encarnacion Strand getting optioned on Tuesday. I mean, clearly this was some kind of you have to get your roster down situation across the league. And yet the Yankees didn't do that with Anthony Volpe. They're keeping him around. And he had another big game on Wednesday, reached base 3 times, stole another base, had a couple really nice plays at shortstop. It seemed like a long shot coming in that he could push Oswald Peraza for that role, but he has been the one getting all of the headlines this spring.
And Peraza hasn't done much. I know he hit a home run on Tuesday night, but he's, batting 200 or whatever so far in the spring. We like both guys long-term, but I just kind of wonder what is the playing time going to be like this season for redraft leagues.
And Volpe's the much better prospect. Peraza is considered a decent prospect, but Volpe is a borderline top 10 guy across baseball. So
I don't want to undersell
versus top 50.
I'm not saying
really good. Yeah.
I'm not saying Peraza's, but like he's a little older, I'm pretty sure, and he's just not viewed as a the potential impact guy that Volpe could be. So it's probably a situation where like if they're both on similar timetables, you could look at it both ways, right? You could look at it and say, well, the way that I think the Rays did this with Taylor Walls instead of I can't even remember Wander Franco, where they called up Taylor Walls, and it was like, why are they calling up a shortstop prospect who isn't Wander Franco? And it's like, well, you could see like, let's see what this guy can do. Maybe we catch lightning a bottle. We don't have to call up Wander Franco yet, but you could also just look at it and say, well, if they're on the same timetable, just call up the better player. And Anthony Volpe is probably the better player. So, I could see it being that way. And then the fact that he's having a much better spring might just lock it up for him. No, Volpe is definitely someone who has gone from fringe consideration in drafts early in the spring to someone who I think in even your 12-team leagues probably needs to be drafted.
I moved him ahead of Peraza himself, who I'd been talking up as a sleeper. Now I'd just straight up rather take Volpe.
All right. Well, let's take an early break here on Fantasy Baseball today. When we get back, we'll talk salary cap draft strategy right after this.
Get breaking news.
Big news coming out of the NFL today.
Highlights and instant reactions.
The largest final round comeback in tour championship history. We're down to the final four.
I just want to take time to analyze greatness.
Talk winners and losers with a guy who's already a big winner.
CBS Sports HQ. It's all sports all day long.
Salary cap draft strategy. To be totally honest, we can do an entire week's worth of content just talking about this topic. We're going to try and cram it into like 20, 25 minutes. So let's see how this goes. Again, also known as auctions. And if you have not done or played in a format like this before, I highly recommend it. I think it is the best way to play fantasy, anything, fantasy baseball, fantasy football. It does not matter. You can get whatever players you want, get your targets. You're not restricted by where you're drafting in a snake draft. And especially if you could do one in person, get everybody inside of a room, man, there is nothing better than doing a live salary cap draft. One of the first questions we usually receive about this format is, how do you distribute your money? We're typically talking about a $260 budget. I feel like 70-30 in favor of hitting is quite common. I've changed it the past couple of years to reflect recent trends, the JBE. So if you're doing 70-30
era, Frank, come on. Acronyms are stupid.
No, they're not.
They're insider language that newcomers are like, what are they talking about? Government likes to use acronyms. I mean,
what's wrong with the government, Scott?
We're saving one syllable by saying JBE instead of juice ball year. Just say juice ball year.
All right, fair enough. Scott, we'll start with you. Do you have a typical breakdown of how you like to spend your money in a salary cap draft?
No. I don't. I've never thought about it in those terms, except when I get asked this question, and I'm like, people think about it in those terms. I just look at the positions I want and the amount I'll probably have to spend at them, and try to make a budget that way, and don't ever calculate, okay, this percentage on pitching. I'm curious to see how much I spent on pitching this year, where I was trying to de-emphasize it and get back to more of an old school approach with a much higher, like some might say excessively high percentage of my budget going to hitting. So let me look into that, because I think apart from the 28 I spent on Sandy Alcantara, I spent no more than $3 on any pitcher. So it can't be that much that I spent in total.
Just to put this in perspective, I know the overall hitter pitcher split in my NL only labor draft was 67-33 in favor of hitting. I think I wound up at like 62% hitting. That wasn't the plan. I was trying to go 65%, but a few things just didn't work out. Chris, I feel like when we did our live draft last week, I asked you this question. You typically don't come up with a very stringent plan, right? You have an idea of players that you want, but what is that idea usually? Is it just, hey, I have a few main targets, or do you think about like each position and you try to find players at that position? What do you think?
Well, I would say that work is mostly done months ago when I come up with my auction values and or my salary cap values. Like that work, it comes in terms of when I'm valuing players themselves, valuing them relative to the other players at their positions, valuing them to the pool as a whole. Once I'm actually drafting I'm not like, I've spent 36% of my budget on pitchers, I have to stop. Like it's not really that way. It depends on how the draft is going, where the values are. And even sometimes like just what I've drafted so far and how that'll impact it. So no, I'm not really too worried about, spending X percentage of my budget on one position versus the other now.
I spent 80-20 on the 12-team Roto
geez.
salary cap draft. 80% to hitting, 20% to pitching. Almost exact.
I'm trying to find. Was that the head-to-head auction league?
It was
No.
Memorial Magazine.
Okay. For some reason, the results aren't showing up for me there.
I don't think there's a right answer to this question either, because I've talked to really great and smart players who have said, I kind of have an idea going in, but I'm just going to take the values where they fall and I'll kind of figure it out on the fly kind of thing. I am the opposite, and maybe that's to my detriment, but I will try to have 3 options at a similar price range at each position.
Yeah. That's what I do. That's the extent of my planning too, because you can't, unless it's a really high end type that you're willing to break the bank for, you're really willing to go beyond projected values by $3 or $4. And if I know that, I'm usually just going to plan for going over the budget $3 or $4. You can't zero in on one player unless it's that class of player, because you just have no idea what the rest of the room's going to do, and you have no idea if it's going to be a reasonable amount, particularly if it's a buzzable player, like a really buzzy player that everybody's excited about. You're probably going to underestimate how much he goes for. And so you need to have, like you said, Frank, 2 or 3 players, 2 or 3 options in that same price range.
And it's just like, it also kind of depends on what time of the draft a player gets thrown out at. Sometimes a $25 player goes for 30 because he got thrown out early. Sometimes a $25 player goes for 18 because he got thrown out late. So, it also, like, I looked it up. I spent 73% of my budget on hitters, 27% on pitchers. That feels fine to me, but it could have very easily gone the other way, because there was definitely a second pitcher. I had Justin Verlander for 27. My next highest was 13 with, I think, Robbie Ray. There was definitely another starting pitcher in the higher end that I was looking at, who I was involved with the bidding until the end. And my ratio could have been a lot different in that instance. So, I try not to go in with a plan just because I know myself. And I know that, like, when I want something, like, here's an example in real life. I decided to build a computer a couple of years ago, and I decided on Tuesday, because I couldn't find a PS5 available anywhere to buy. So I was like, screw it. I'm going to build a computer. I'm just going to spend twice as much money on building a computer. Total impulse decision.
Okay.
And I was like, I'm going to do this right now. And my wife had to be like, no, it's okay. You can wait until Friday when you're off work. You don't. And that's why if I want something, I tend to be impulsive and I tend to fixate on it. And so I try not to come up with a rigid plan, because I don't want to hyper fixate on X players and end up kind of forgetting about the rest of the player pool, when there's, always going to be good values to be found in a salary cap draft.
I wasn't expecting today's podcast to become philosophical, but I think there's something to that, Chris. It's knowing yourself too.
Yeah, I mean, there's psychology to it. Yeah.
You guys see this run, like every day, this rundown, I go pretty crazy on it because, I like things to be organized. I like to have a plan. I like to know where things are going. And that's exactly how I plan out my salary cap.
And I'm just a disaster.
No, I wouldn't say that. Come on. Just getting back,
I'm saying it.
Just getting back to the point I was making before about the 3 similar players, 3 players in a similar price range. I think it's especially important in Roto to find 3 players that have similar skill sets, because for me, it's just easier to track my stats if I find players with similar skill sets. For example, in my NL only labor draft, I had Rhys Hoskins, Christian Walker, Rowdy Tellez written down for first base, $18 to $20. I think all those players are going to be relatively similar. They're going to hit around, 240 to 250, 30 plus home runs. So that's what I like to do. And I'll do that for each individual position in my draft. But I think it's also knowing your format too, because in Tout Wars this Sunday, it's a live salary cap draft, 12-team head-to-head points league. Typically, those are shallower formats. It's Roto style lineups. So what I've done the past 2 years, I don't really spend more than $30 or $35 on any player. I live in the mid-tier because guys like Corey Seager or Bregman, I know that they go for cheaper in this league, and they're really good standouts in that format. So I think, again, knowing your format as well, Scott, I mean, you went stars and scrubs in our most previous draft, but if it was a deeper league, you might have shopped in the mid-tier more, something like you've done in an AL or NL only league.
Yeah, and those are obviously opposite extremes. So the one you're talking about, a 15-team league with the standard roto lineups, that's on the deeper end of the pool. It's not so insanely deep that I think you have to really check the impulse to buy a high-end player. But as a general rule, the scarcer your waiver wire is going to be, so the deeper your league is, the scarcer the waiver wire is going to be, the more you need to ensure yourself production at every spot. And that means that's the opposite of stars and scrubs. That's a scrub in that league risks being a black hole in your lineup situation, right? And that's the quickest way to lose. So in order to ensure that your worst players aren't just zeros, you have to spread your dollars a little more evenly. But that probably doesn't go for the majority of the audience, because the majority of the audience doesn't even play in anything as deep as a 15-teamer.
Right.
I would say that 12 teams or fewer, like the Memorial Magazine League, the one we've been referencing, which isn't even as shallow as it gets. I mean, we still have 360 players rostered in this league, but it's shallow enough that I do prefer to go the stars and scrubs route, where I, for instance, I bought Aaron Judge for 48. I had Nolan Arenado, Jose Altuve, Corey Seager, Sandy Alcantara, Cedric Mullins. And then, as I talked about, I had a bunch of $2, $3 pitchers and several $2, $3 hitters as well. Those are the scrubs, obviously, to pair with those studs. And the key to the stars and scrubs approach is that your scrubs presumably aren't actually going to be scrubs. They're going to be players who you think have a lot of upside, who you think maybe just slipped through the cracks and went for less than they should.
It's basically stars and sleepers, Scott.
Kind of. Yeah, it kind of is. And the key being with, okay, you need to be able to rely on the waiver wire some, is because all of those sleepers aren't going to work out. You're going to need to cycle through a few options at some of those positions probably before you land on the right ones. But you have this really sturdy foundation of studs who, if you can just fill in the rest of your roster with players who are pretty good, the overall outcome, the bottom line is going to end up better than somebody who distributed his dollars more evenly. So you have to know your style of play to do that. You have to know how aggressive you plan to be on the waiver wire, how good you are at picking out sleepers, and how good you are at controlling impulses during the draft. Because you noticed I said the scrubs were $2 and $3 players. I didn't say they were $1 players. I think the biggest key to this strategy is you have to know when you've spent all you can afford to spend and are only willing to go $2, $3 on anybody who gets nominated at that point. Because if you end up blowing out your budget and are left with a bunch of roster spots to fill for $1 each, you're in big trouble, because you can only win players you yourself nominated at that point. You can't jump in on anybody else's nominations, and so you get your 1 in 12 chance to nominate, unless it slips through without anybody else nominating it. You don't get them, and you just have to wait that long again to nominate somebody else. And chances are all the good players, all the good sleepers you were targeting, you're not going to get any.
That's what happened for me in the draft. You talk about discipline, and
impulse
I ended
control,
up pushing Nick Castellanos to $6. And that's like, I'm fine if I get Nick Castellanos for, say, I think it was $6, but that was my max bid at that time. So once I had him, it was $6, and I was down to just dollar bids. And it's like, I ended up with some decent ones: Trevor Rogers, Anthony Rendon, Josiah Gray, Keibert Ruiz. Like there's some interesting players there, but the bottom half of my roster, the gap between a $3 outfielder I probably could have gotten and Nick Castellanos, and then the $2 players I could have gotten instead of Dylan Floro are, there's probably some room there that I wish I would have navigated a little better, which is why, again, I struggle with the impulse control.
Yeah.
So that's a limitation of myself that I know that I have to be super conscious of in my salary cap drafts, especially early on, because I have a tendency to just be like, I'm going to be on every player. And I have definitely found myself sitting there for 2 hours with nothing to do because I spent $180 on 3 players,
What about the nomination process? And this can go many different directions. I think a lot of people, Scott, will typically nominate players they don't want to get money off the table, but you have to be careful with that because say the player that you do want winds up being the last player in that tier. You're like, I don't really want Manny Machado. I don't want Rafael Devers. I really want Austin Riley. So you nominate those other two, you get money off the table. There's a chance Austin Riley could go for more money than those guys because everybody else in the room also knows, all right, this is the last elite tier third baseman. I got to spend up to make sure I get him. So it's a fine line.
Well, that could be how it plays out, or it could be how it played out in the Memorial Magazine League where I took Nolan Arenado for $32 because I knew it was only Austin Riley left, and then Riley went for $32 himself.
Right?
So that was frustrating.
And then you'll see stuff like I'm looking at a 4-pick stretch from the draft last week where Trey Turner went for 43. Okay, he's a top 5 player. Juan Soto, whose consensus ranked lower than Trey Turner, went for 45. And then Mookie Betts, who consensus is right with Juan Soto, went for 42. And so it's also like it can tend to be all over the place. And I think Mookie was kind of the last player in the tier. Kyle Tucker was still out there. He went for 38. So I think that's probably the best value among those high-end outfielders. But it's also, sort of hard to predict. And I'm looking at Edwin Diaz went for 22 right after that.
To get back to your point about who you should nominate when, Frank, I've found that in the earliest stages when there's kind of a player or 2 or 3 that my whole strategy depends on, I just go ahead and nominate them because I need to know if it's realistic. I'm going to get them at the price I want to get them for, because if I can't, then I need to have something else to pivot to. And if that player's nomination is delayed to the point that all the comparable talents are gone by the time he's nominated, it's like I got nothing else to spend this big wad of cash on. And I wish I had known that when other players I liked were being bid on,
Yeah,
so
there's value in cost certainty.
Yeah. So I tend to nominate players, and this, it's not universal, but I tend to nominate players I want early and then players I don't want thereafter. Certainly when I get to the point where I've spent the majority of my money and I'm just looking to hop in for $2 or $3 on other people's nominations. When they nominate for one, I jump in 2 or 3 right away. Certainly once I'm at that point, I'm nominating players. And these are kind of, lower end players that I'm nominating, but that's when I nominate players I don't want for $1. But specifically, it's players I don't want who I could live with getting for $1.
Players you don't want
for low end.
Players you don't want for $2.
Right, exactly. Players I could accept for $1, but I wouldn't want to spend more than $1 on them. And I hope somebody else bids 2 or 3 and I can actually get a player I really do want instead. That's usually when I'm nominating players I don't want.
I think there's a big strategy when it comes to bidding as well. And we talked about this live while we were doing the draft, where I will change it up. There'll be times where I'm super aggressive. As soon as someone else bids, I'll bid right away again. Or if a player is slowing down, I'll wait going once, going twice. All right, I'll go back in just to kind of throw people off and make them think like, all right, maybe this is the last, dollar that I'm willing to go, and just throw somebody off like that. They think that they want them. So there's definitely psychology involved in bidding like that. And so I think changing up your cadence is something I like to do. And if you ever do a live salary cap draft, if you have a player priced at a certain point, for example, I keep going back to this because it's still so fresh in my mind. NL only labor. I had Lindor priced at $30. I was back and forth with, I think it was Ron Chandler, 26, 27. He goes 28. I jump right away to 30. As soon as he says 28, I say 30 because I know that I'm willing to go 30. And if it's a strict room, they're probably going to freeze on that jump bid. So it's something that I like to do as well. Chris, any other things that come to your mind when it comes to bidding strategy?
Yeah, I mean, no, it's like I also understand that I tend to get really frustrated when people do the last second bid to me because I get impatient, I get frustrated, and I think I've got the guy, and I start celebrating. I write him down, and then I don't have, and I have a bad tendency when someone does that to just immediately hit the bid button again. And I've gotten messed up and ended up paying $4 more than I wanted for a player that way. And that's also part of why I try not to have a set group of players that I have to have, because I also know that I'll get caught up in that regard as well. So salary cap drafts are tough for me. On a psychological level, it's exhausting. Just beyond the fact that they're 4 hours long, which you have to prepare yourself for, but it's also like, you have to know your weaknesses and strengths as a player. You have to know how your league tends to go, because, if you've been playing with the same group of people for 10 years, there are going to be things that everyone knows about everyone else. There's going to, there's always the guy who likes the best players from 4 years ago. That's just a guy in every fantasy league. And there's going to be the person who's obsessed with sleepers and will pay up for every breakout. I used to play in an NL only league with it was me and Heath and a bunch of Cardinals fans. And so every Cardinals player went for way more than they should have. And one of my fantasy football leagues, we're all from Miami. Dolphins players go for way more than they should. So it's like, that we can talk strategy and we can talk general strategy, but a lot of it, especially more so than in any other type of draft, comes down to the people in your league and knowing their tendencies and what they tend to go for and how aggressive they tend to be. Like that's all stuff that you have to keep in mind. Like, I think it's beat on every time we do a salary cap draft with him. He's going to try to get two or three of the first round guys. He just does that every time. And it's, that's one of the things you start to notice trends with people when you draft with them.
It's interesting talking about how it affects you psychologically and just, being in touch with your own, the way your emotions are going to play out over the course of those 4 hours, because it's exhausting for me too. I mean, there will come a point in every single salary cap draft where I hate this whole process. And I think the world is ending because I either I couldn't bring myself to bid $1 more on a player who I hadn't really planned for, but the price was just so good. And so I'm like, I don't know. And I don't bid on him, or I do bid on him and win him. And it's like, crap. Now what do I do? My plan is falling apart. I didn't budget for this. And there's always a moment like that. And I think the key for me in those moments, so like it's different. Like the way like you have trouble controlling your impulses, Chris, and me, it's like when it doesn't go according to plan, how do I improvise? And that's where it gets stressful for me. And it never goes exactly according to plan. I've never had a salary cap draft where I've perfectly allocated all of my dollars for maximum efficiency, and I never will, because there's no way to anticipate how every player who's nominated is going to play out, so you can always look back and, like the example I gave earlier, I went 32 on Arenado and I could have had Riley for that amount. Well, you just don't know. I mean, Manny Machado and Rafael Devers both went for near 40 before that Arenado bid happened. And so it was reasonable to anticipate Riley would go for the same amount. And it just didn't work. And you just never know. And you can never know. And you can't beat yourself up over that. You have to, at least if you are wired more like me, you have to have, you need to have you need to be able to compartmentalize. You need to kind of have tunnel vision and not worry so much about what could have been if you had done X or Y differently.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well said. Again, salary cap drafts, I love them. There's a lot of strategy that goes into these types of into this format, and everyone is different. You can't just say, oh, well, this player went for this much in this draft. Corbin Carroll went for $25. That means I should expect to spend 25. Maybe you'll get him for 18. Maybe you'll get him for 20. That's why it's really hard to put out salary cap values too, because again, just every draft is so different.
This is like therapy. Like, Scott, do you want to go lay on the couch? I feel like we're working through some stuff here.
Yeah, I'm sure you could just take that microphone and slide on over to the couch over there, Scott, plug it in and just talk away while you're laying down.
I could just kick back.
Yeah, why
get
not?
It all off my chest.
Anywho, there are some other things that we want to get to. Again, I think we could do an entire week's worth of content just on salary cap drafts. But let's take our final break here, and we'll be back on Fantasy Baseball Today.
You need to know what you're getting into. This is not cops and robbers. The enemy is everywhere, but he can't be seen.
Why me? None of this makes sense.
It's a mind game, John.
What have you gotten me into?
I can't tell the difference between what's real and what's not.
Before I get into some news and notes, we have a really fun announcement. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but don't worry. I'll mention it in a future podcast as well. Fantasy Baseball Today is a finalist in the baseball category for the Sports Podcast Awards. It's an awesome thing to be a part of. We're obviously stoked to be a part of it. We're going up against some big names, and it is a voting system, which means that we need your help. You can scan the QR code in the top right corner if you're watching on video, or find the link in the podcast or YouTube description. You'll need to quickly create an account on their site, which I know it's annoying. I'm sorry. It takes less than a minute. I did it myself. And then vote for Fantasy Baseball Today. Voting ends April 6th, and we appreciate your help. Some news and notes. Jose Quintana will indeed be out until at least July with a stress fracture in his rib cage. David Peterson threw 4 no-hit innings with 5 strikeouts on Tuesday. His slider velocity was up almost 3 miles per hour. And that comes 1 or 2 days after Tyler McGill had an awesome start. Do you guys have a lean here? Because frankly, whoever wins that job between Peterson or McGill could have decent sleeper value for fantasy.
Yeah, I tend to lean McGill. I think he's shown a little more upside, but I think both of them are interesting, late round flyer types. And, we've still got 2 weeks of spring training left, so there might be room for both of them. You know how these things go. We don't know how Kodai Senga, it seems like a minor issue with the finger, but it could be delayed. So, I say keep both of them on your radar, but I would lean McGill.
Brewers manager Craig Counsell said the team will, quote, go slow in working Garrett Mitchell back from his right hamstring injury. The team is apparently aiming for March 21st as a return date, which if he returns next week, I think he'll still be good for opening day, but we'll see with Garrett Mitchell. Andres Munoz is set to make his spring debut on Friday. He was delayed due to offseason foot surgery, but looks like he should be good to go. Tigers beat writer, apologies if you're listening, I'm going to butcher this name, Cody Stavengagen, that's what we'll go with, believes Alex Lang is the most likely closer candidate to begin the season, which we suspected, but it's nice to read it from a beat writer as well. Kyle Finnegan was told early in spring that he could be used in more of a fireman role rather than being limited to the 9th inning. Hunter Harvey and Alex Colome were mentioned by Bobby Blanco of Masson as 2 names that could see save chances. Scott, are you buying this with the Nationals bullpen?
I mean, I think Finnegan's still the guy to have. Usually the one in that fireman role still gets the majority of the save chances. It's just that he isn't always preserved for the 9th, but it's not what you want to hear, particularly coming from a team that isn't going to have that many save chances to begin with. And I wasn't really counting on Finnegan as a late round option for saves. I like somebody like Alex Lang more, for instance. I always want to say Andrew Lang. Remember Andrew Lang? Spelled the name differently, Lang, but all right, center from the early 90s. Anyway.
I don't.
Yeah. You were still in diapers then, weren't you?
Early 90s, probably. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay.
A couple other news items here. Brian De La Cruz could be squeezed off the opening day roster. Wow, how things have changed. It's not great.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just Jesus Sanchez doesn't have options, and he's having a really good spring for what it's worth. He's run a lot. I think he has 3 steals. So, we could do the Jesus Sanchez sleeper thing one more time, Frank.
Hey, I got him in the Scott White Dynasty League, so I'm on board with Jesus Sanchez. Of course, the Marlins recently signed Yuli Gurriel and Jose Iglesias, so that's part of the reason they have this roster crunch as of now. Justin Turner is scheduled to take batting practice Friday. He was hit in the face with a pitch last weekend and required 16 stitches as a result. Jose Trevino said Wednesday that he's dealing with some inflammation in his sprained right wrist, but is very confident he'll be available for opening day. Mark Melancon is likely to open the regular season on the IL due to a right shoulder injury. All right, one of 7 different saves possibilities for the Arizona Diamondbacks. So it's one less name we have to worry about. Performances worth mentioning recently. Lars Nootbaar in the WBC, 6 for 14 with 2 steals, playing for Japan. I'm starting to wonder, will he run a little bit this year? 74th percentile in sprint speed last season. That's pretty exciting for Lars Nootbaar. Garrett Whitlock made his spring debut, 2 hitless relief innings, 3 strikeouts to 1 walk. Anthony Volpe, Scott, you mentioned the game that he had, reached base 3 times, another stolen base, a run, an RBI, was the leadoff hitter on Wednesday. If he makes the team and he's playing shortstop, there's a non-zero chance that Volpe is leading off for the Yankees, which is crazy.
Yeah, it would make a lot of sense looking at his skill set. He draws walks at a high rate. I think most of the time I've seen him in the lineup for the Yankees, it's been in the leadoff spot this spring. He had 50 steals in the minors last year. I don't know why this hasn't been something that's phased out. It's like an old school thing that's remained where, okay, we need our leadoff hitter to be a base stealer. I feel like base stealers should bat behind the power hitters because that's the stretch of the lineup where you're going to need to manufacture runs. Like if you're batting them in front of the power hitters, then what's the incentive to run? You just might run into an out, and I don't know. I feel like that needs to change, but there doesn't seem to be much momentum for it. So yeah, the fact that Volpe steals a lot of bases helps his chances of batting leadoff.
And lastly, Justin Verlander threw 5 one-hit innings with 8 strikeouts to just 1 walk, 12 swinging strikes on 71 pitches. He was going up against a WBC depleted Cardinals team, but the guy looks like he's in midseason form. I think Justin Verlander is going to be just fine. ADP risers and fallers in March. So how did I put this together? Using RotoWire Online Championship ADP, that's over at the NFBC. It's a certain format that they have. They are 12-team roto leagues with waiver wires. So this is probably the most common, format, at least comparatively to what other people are playing, that is available over at the NFBC. So it's comparing February to the first 2 weeks of March and seeing who has moved up, who has moved down. And we'll start with the biggest risers in the top 100. Corbin Carroll, no surprise. He's up 16 spots from 69 to 52. Salvador Perez is up to pick 66. He's slowly been rising. Andres Jimenez, I don't really know why or if I believe this one. I mean, I guess it's happening, but he's moved up about 8 spots to pick 77. Kenley Jansen, I feel like I've seen him slip more as well. O'Neal Cruz, I think that name makes sense. He's up to pick 60. So I think a lot of the times we see O'Neal Cruz go in the 5th round of a 12-team league. Chris, are there any names or prices here that seem prohibitive for you? I know during yesterday's draft, you said, look, if Corbin Carroll is going to be a 4th or even 5th round pick, I'm just probably not going to wind up with him.
Yeah, like I think there's a lot to like about him. I have him ranked 64th, so I'm certainly not out on Corbin Carroll even at this price, but it certainly probably means that more often than not, and I would say much more often than not, I'm not going to draft Corbin Carroll. And hey, you're only one of 12 people. Only one of them can get Corbin Carroll in any given draft. So that's not really saying much. But yeah, there are probably not going to be many situations where Corbin Carroll is currently the top player on my queue as my pick is up. It's going to be someone else. That's a little bit frustrating. There will probably be a point where I have to reach for Corbin Carroll to make sure I get him. The problem is, as we talked about the other day, I think on Monday's show, you can kind of start throwing ADP out. once you get about a week away from the start of the season. So I'm thinking about like podcast listeners league, for the people league, leagues where by nature, the people playing in these leagues are going to be people who are really into fantasy baseball. I mean, Corbin Carroll might go in like the third round in some of those leagues.
I think our last mock draft,
I think he went 34th
for the show
or something, right?
Yeah, he was in the third round.
So like,
I have Corbin Carroll the highest of the three of us for Roto. I have him 56th overall, and I'm to the point where I would like. I think I think his best case scenario is higher probability than the average rookie, and I think his best case scenario has him putting up at least second round numbers. And so I want to reach for him. I'm willing to, but there's always somebody who's willing to reach a little bit more for him. And so I think I've only gotten him in a head-to-head points league so far among those that were playing out. That survey I did on social media, on Twitter and Facebook last week, Corbin Carroll, it was actually a tie between Corbin Carroll and O'Neal Cruz for who's your must-have player for this year. They got the most two responses, those two.
And the thing I would just keep in mind is there's a lot to like about Corbin Carroll. I think he's a really talented player. One, he's still relatively unproven, 115 plate appearances at the major league level. Also, he plays in a really tough home park. And so while I really like his skill set and I like his chances of getting there, the home park is an obstacle. It's not a huge obstacle. It's certainly not an insurmountable one, but Chase Field is one of the toughest home parks in baseball since they introduced the humidor, especially for power. Remember, they've got the 20-foot yellow line, the yellow line 20 feet off the ground in center field. So it's a little pricey for me. Yeah.
What about the biggest fallers in the top 100? No surprise with these names: Carlos Rodon, Joe Musgrove, Yordan Alvarez down to 14.6. Scott, are you buying at that cost? That would be an early second round pick.
Oh gosh. Yeah. I mean, I'm still taking him ahead of Mookie Betts. I think he's like my number 9 player right now, Yordan Alvarez. And I've dropped him from 7 to 9, but still, yeah, I'm not that worried about the hand, just modest amount of worry.
All right, the biggest risers in the 100 to 200 range. Jordan Walker, no surprise. Again, this is from February to the first 2 weeks of March. He's up 63 spots from 186 to pick 123. Alec Boehm, interesting. A couple of spring training home runs. That'll do it, huh? 16 spots to 183. Vaughn Grissom is up to 159. Jeffrey Springs is up to 153. Chris Sale up exactly around to 124. And I've seen him go even higher in some drafts. It's got a name on here that we haven't really talked about much recently, but Vaughn Grissom, moving up 15 spots to 159. I think this is just people coming to terms with the fact that he's going to be the starting shortstop for the Atlanta Braves. And now that we know that for sure, people are reacting and drafting him like that.
Yeah, that's probably it. People seem, if there's any doubts about playing time, especially in an FBC where you don't have any IL spots, so that makes your bench spots more precious, and it's hard to just stash away prospective options there. Harder to do that. People seem really disinclined to invest in playing time concerns, and so I never really bought the idea that the Braves let Swanson walk and sign nobody to replace him so that Orlando Arcia could be their starter. That just doesn't seem like the sort of thing a championship caliber club does. So I was always on board with Vaughn Grissom, but I think now everybody's coming around to the reality of that. And by the way, I mean, the same thing with Miguel Vargas. I know he's not on here. I don't think he is he?
Oh, he's on the rundown, Scotty. Don't you worry.
Okay, I won't jump ahead then.
I mean, I don't know if we're going to get to him, but he's moved up to pick 200 at the NFBC. But in the drafts that we're doing, he's still going way before that. So sometimes,
yeah, just since he returned to swinging a bat, he's now 195th. When his total ADP. Miguel Vargas is more like 250, 37 on NFBC. So that's another situation where I think, again, I was never really doubting he was the Dodgers second baseman. Even when he couldn't swing a bat, they were having him play second base so that he'd be up to speed defensively. But I think just by virtue of, he can't swing a bat, it created this concern where, maybe he doesn't win the job. And now that's going away because he's swinging a bat and swinging it quite well.
4 more risers inside of the top 200. Lars Nootbaar and Riley Green. Expected. A lot of people talking about them this time of year. Both are having either good springs or World Baseball Classic performance for Lars Nootbaar. Lars is up to 171 and Riley Green is up to 191. Taylor Ward is up 9 spots to 106. I think we're kind of pushing it now with Taylor Ward. He's getting up there. Pablo Lopez up 9 spots to 172. So, Chris, 3 names here for sure that I know you like: Nootbaar, Riley Green, Pablo Lopez. Taylor Ward, I wrote him up in Sleepers 1.0 like 2 months ago because he was going at pick 125. If you move up 2 rounds of value that early in the draft, it actually matters a lot. So I think we're pushing limits here on Taylor Ward and the ADP.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends on what you value, right? Because you've got this pretty long track record for a 28-year-old player of him not being particularly good, including both the majors and the minors. Now, the major league track record before last season, somewhat limited, but still you're talking about 160 games where he was like a mid 700s OPS bat. And for most of his minor league career, he was also that kind of hitter until, kind of breaking out at 24, 25 in the PCL. So I think there are reasons to like him. I removed him from my Bust 2.0 column. If he goes inside the top 100, that's where I start to, definitely get a little antsy about the price. I certainly wouldn't be taking him there. He's more like a 125 player for me. So it's more like where he was going before, I think, is fine value. Now, I'm not saying I'm avoiding him, but there's always going to be someone who likes him more than I do.
Biggest fallers inside of the top 250 expected names: Seiya Suzuki down to 166, Harrison Bader 225, Adalberto Mondesi 237, Mitch Haniger down to 202, Tony Gonsolin at 190, Kyle Wright at 150. This group, I don't fully understand why they're dropping. It could just be the result of other names are moving up. Someone's got to drop, right?
They're all injured, Frank.
Is that true? Well, no, I'm talking this next.
No, the expected group are all injured. Yeah.
Yeah. This next group, I was kind of previewing the names.
Okay, you're previewing. Okay, sorry, my bad.
All good. Andrew Heaney is down to 213. John Gray down to 215. Javier Baez down to 182. And we saw that in the mock draft yesterday, Scott. You got him pretty late. Whit Merrifield down to 198. Oscar Gonzalez, somebody I like quite a bit, down to 206. You see any reason here, Scotty?
So I was looking up where exactly I got Javier Baez because I think it was much later than that.
One thing I will say, having the experience of rooting for Puerto Rico during the World Baseball Classic, is like, man, having Javier Baez on a team that you're rooting for really changes the experience of rooting for Javier Baez. Because I'm mostly like, he kind of gets a bad rap. He's better than Penn. It's like, oh boy, I may have cursed him out on a couple swings tonight.
His swing decisions are bad.
Yeah, real bad stuff.
I think this group: Andrew Heaney, John Gray, Javier Baez, Whit Merrifield, Oscar Gonzalez. So they all, I guess the common thread there is just that they haven't given us anything to be excited about yet. I mean, during off-season drafting before spring training started, you could make a case for them all to exceed their draft position. So they were kind of preemptive sleepers, I guess. But now, they're not the guys making noise of the ones we had kind of pre-marked as sleepers. They're not the ones doing anything to really capture everybody's imagination. So they're kind of just sagging relative to everyone else is my guess. I don't know that that's fair. I don't know that that's a logical enough reason to fade them, but it makes some sense maybe as an explanation.
I'll take John Gray and Oscar Gonzalez. So if those guys are falling, sure, I'll gobble that up. Scott, yesterday you got Javier Baez at pick 192, so not far off. 10 spots after this ADP, but he is a clear faller right now. A couple names I'm just going to shuffle through, and you guys tell me yay or nay if you're in on the new price tag. Jared Kelenic at 218. He's moved up about 70 spots compared to February.
That's fine. I think it's a relatively low probability bet, but it's fine.
Yeah, I agree. There might still be some outfielders I prefer at that point, but there might not.
Alex Lang at 192, just inside the top 200.
Boy, it's hard to pull these numbers out of the blue without knowing what others at that position are there at the same point. So 192 is in between Paul Sewald and Jose Leclerc generally. So that sounds about right for Alex Lang. Sure.
Okay. Tristan Casas at 216.
It's great.
Yeah, I like him more than Kelenic, so I'm going to say I'm on board for that.
I've got him at 181.
Ezekiel Tovar at 224. I have a feeling, Scott, you're smashing the draft button.
I have him more like 164. So
yep, I've got him 163.
Nice.
I think Tovar, as I've said multiple times, is maybe the most undervalued player in drafts this year.
Zach Eflin is up to 257.
I don't understand. Like, the fantasy community keeps like doing like Zach Eflin sleeper, and like
I think it's the Tampa Bay Rays too.
Chris. What is it in his track record that makes us think like we're 700 innings into his major league career? 413, 397, 417, 404. Those ERAs over the last 4 seasons. He's had injury issues. Like, I think he's one of those players who rates out pretty well by like the various stuff metrics. And so maybe that's it. But I just like at some point the results are what they are. And I think like a 29-year-old with 700 major league innings, like probably is what he is.
He revamped one of his pitches last year. I think it was the curveball. And I'm not a Zach Eflin guy. I'm kind of just playing devil's advocate here. And he ended up with a 3.27 xERA as part of that. And Frank, as you were saying, I mean, it was surprising that an organization as thrifty as the Rays gave him such a big free agent contract. Like normally the Rays are the team that signed the interesting player before he deserves, tens of millions of dollars, and then he leaves the Rays and gets that contract. But this time they kind of just went ahead and gave him Zach Eflin the money before it even happened. And why is that the guy the Rays are willing to spend on? It's weird.
Didn't they say they did something similar with Alex Cobb, right? I'm remembering that correctly.
I have no idea what the terms of the Alex Cobb deal were, but the terms of the Zach Eflin deal were,
and like they traded Willie Adames right before he became one of the better shortstops. Like we do this thing
3 years, $40 million.
We give the Rays like they're like magic, and it's like, no, they mess up too. Like I get it, they're smart, but they're not like that much smart. I don't see it with Zach Eflin. Maybe he'll shove and make me look dumb, but I don't see it.
We're talking about a pick in the 250 range, which is Carlos Carrasco, Adam Wainwright. I mean, there are ones below that I prefer to Eflin, like Trevor Rogers. And I'm sure there are others. That's the one who jumped out at me. Hayden Wesneski. I think
Trevor Rogers is cheaper than that, right?
Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah.
Edward Cabrera is cheaper than that.
Rogers has moved up too. He's a big riser. He's up to 223.
So he wouldn't be my choice, Eflin, but that's not an insane range to take him.
He just never comes up for me.
Yeah.
All right. How about Oscar Colas? It looks like he's getting closer to locking up that starting right field job for the White Sox. He's up to 265, which still sounds too late.
It does. I don't know why.
I think that's fine.
I think I've kind of like gravitated more toward Garrett Mitchell and Jake Fraley lately, and so that's kind of, you can't have them all, so I keep missing out on Oscar Colas. But Colas has looked great this spring, and I probably need to stop doing that.
The hype is growing for Reed Detmers. He's up to 185, but I think for good reason. I'm good. I'm good with it.
I added him to my Breakouts 2.0 that just came out on the site. I think, the big thing, I think we mentioned it on yesterday or the day before, but his velocity's up like 2 or 3 miles an hour in camp so far. And we already saw the breakout. I mean, he had a 3.04 ERA or whatever it was after coming back from the minors last season with an even better FIP. So I think there's only room to grow. There's a ceiling on how good he can be because they're going to use a 6-man rotation, and he'll, won't give you 2 start weeks and probably maxes out at like 150 innings, but they could be really, really good innings. I think him and Patrick Sandoval are both definitely, rising for me.
Last name here on the list, Hunter Brown is up to 188 with the injury to Lance McCullers, though McCullers has started a throwing program. So I don't know. Maybe he's back at some point in like May or June. I'm speculating. Scott, what do you think about the price tag Hunter Brown inside the top 100?
I kind of think McCullers is going to be back before then, for what it's worth. It sounds like he was really downplaying the injury the other day.
Okay.
He would have reason to, I understand, but yeah, I'm a little surprised Hunter Brown's climbed this much. He's been shaky with the control this spring, and that was the big knock on him in the minors. It was surprising that he came up throwing strikes as regularly as he did. A much higher strike percentage than he had in the minors, and obviously over a much smaller sample. So that could rear its ugly head, and Brown leaves everybody high and dry. And I think it's especially surprising given that obviously we're talking about roto ADP here. So the relief pitcher eligibility doesn't even come into play for Brown. I understand him going 188th overall in a points league where you get that advantage of slotting him in the RP spot. But I don't know. There are definitely pitchers in that range that I would prefer to Brown.
Have you considered that his delivery looks a lot like Justin Verlander's?
I had no clue.
Yeah. It's a big deal.
They keep calling him mini JV, right?
I feel like 20% of the hype around Hunter Brown is just that he kind of looks like Justin Verlander when he pitches.
Remember when who was it? Melky Cabrera first got called up for the Tigers? Was that it? It was Avisail Garcia. Sorry, Avisail Garcia. And
Joe looked like Miguel Cabrera.
Joe Buck said he might be the next Miguel Cabrera, and then
yikes.
I mean, he was just doing a natural broadcasting transition, like Miguel Cabrera probably came up to the plate, and then
they have very similar body types.
Yeah, but it just kind of like followed him around through the rest of his career, inflating his stock. It was a weird moment in time.
And now he plays on the Marlins. So
now we know why the Marlins gave him that contract.
It's all come full circle. We're going to wrap there. For Scott and Chris, I am Frank. Thanks as always for watching and listening Fantasy Baseball today. Please make sure to follow and leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. We'll be back again tomorrow. Bye-bye.